Stop right there, ma'am. You don't belong here. The words hit Angela Johnson like a physical blow as she stepped out of her car that evening, her heels clicking against the freshly paved driveway. The voice belonged to Frank Whitaker, the 70-year-old president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, his pale face pinched in disapproval. Behind him stood two other board members, arms crossed, their expressions unreadable in the dim porch light. Angela, a federal judge and one of the few black homeowners in the gated community, forced a polite smile. "Is there a problem, Mr. Whitaker?" Frank's lips thinned. "Your trash cans were left out past noon. Again, that's a violation of HOA policy." A flicker of irritation passed through her. She had been in court all day, overseeing a high-profile case, and hadn't had time to wheel the bins back. "I'll take care of it," she said evenly, shifting her briefcase to her other hand. But Frank wasn't finished. "And your son's bicycle was left on the lawn yesterday. This isn't some rundown neighborhood, Judge Johnson. We have standards." Angela's grip tightened on her keys. She had moved to Willow Creek for its safety, its pristine streets, its promise of a better life for Marcus. But ever since she and her son had arrived, the hostility had been palpable. Neighbors who once waved now turned away. The woman next door, Mrs. Langley, had called the HOA twice to complain about Marcus playing too loudly in their own backyard. At first, Angela had dismissed it as the usual growing pains of a new home. But then the letters started arriving. Official HOA notices for infractions no one else seemed to get cited for. Grass half an inch too long. A patio chair left outside overnight. Each one carried a thinly veiled threat. Further violations may result in fines or legal action. Then, one evening, Marcus came home from riding his bike, his face streaked with tears. "Some man yelled at me to get off the sidewalk," he mumbled, "said I was scaring his dog." Angela's blood ran cold. She had spent her career fighting injustice in courtrooms. But this was different. This was her home. The next morning, she attended the monthly HOA meeting, determined to address the discrimination head-on. The room fell silent when she walked in. Frank Whitaker adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "We don't usually have new residents attend so soon," he said, the emphasis making her skin prickle. Angela kept her voice steady. "I'd like to understand why my family is being singled out for violations that others aren't." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Langley sniffed. "No one's being singled out. Rules are rules." But Angela had done her homework. She pulled out a folder. In the past month, 12 households left their trash cans out overnight. Only mine received a citation. 3 families have patio furniture visible from the street. Only mine was fined. She paused. "I think we all know why." Frank's face reddened. "Are you accusing this board of something, Judge Johnson?" She met his gaze. "I'm asking for fairness." The room erupted. Some residents shifted uncomfortably. Others glared. Before the meeting adjourned, Frank announced a new proposal: mandatory background checks for all homeowners. "For safety," he said, though his eyes never left Angela. That night, as she tucked Marcus in a bed, her phone buzzed with an email from the HOA's lawyer. "Dear Judge Johnson, due to multiple violations, the board is considering legal action to enforce compliance or, if necessary, revoke your residency rights." Angela stared at the screen, her jaw set. She had fought bigger battles than this, and she wasn't backing down. Because Willow Creek might have been their dream neighborhood, but dreams could turn into nightmares when people like Frank Whitaker held the keys. And Angela Johnson wasn't about to let them lock her out. "Mom, that man told me I wasn't allowed to play here." Marcus's voice trembled as he burst through the front door, his small fists clenched at his sides. Angela's heart lurched. She knelt in front of him, brushing a tear from his cheek. "Who said that, baby?" "Mr. Collins," Marcus sniffed. "He was watching me ride my bike. Then he yelled that I was breaking the rules." Angela's stomach twisted. Richard Collins, the HOA president, had been escalating his campaign against her family for weeks. Fake complaints about her hedges being too tall, citations for leaving a garden hose out too long, and now this direct intimidation of her child. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to stay steady. You didn't break any rules, Marcus. This is your home. You can play outside whenever you want. But inside, fury simmered. Richard Collins wasn't just enforcing bylaws. He was enforcing his own prejudice. A retired real estate developer, he treated the neighborhood like his personal kingdom. And Angela, a black woman who dared to excel in a space he thought belonged to people like him, was a threat to his control. The paper trail of harassment, asterisk. The next morning, Angela sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by a stack of HOA violation notices. Each one was petty, each one unfounded. She cross-referenced them with the community's records, which she had obtained through a public records request. Her findings were damning. No one else asterisk had been cited for leaving trash bins out an hour late. And no one else had been fined for a visible lawn ornament, a single garden gnome Marcus had begged to keep. No one else had been followed by Richard Collins while their child played. It was targeted, deliberate, and, most importantly, asterisk illegal, the breaking point. Then came the email. Subject, final notice, non-compliance. Dear Judge Johnson, asterisk due to repeated violations of community standards, the HOA board has voted to pursue legal action, including possible eviction proceedings. You are hereby ordered to attend a compliance hearing next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Asterisk. Angela's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. Eviction? Over garden gnome? She knew what this was really about. Hashtag the fight begins. Angela had spent her career dismantling systemic injustice. Now, it was in her own backyard. She called her friend and fellow attorney, Daniel Reyes. They're trying to push me out, Dan, she said, and they're using my son to do it. Dan didn't hesitate. We'll bury them. By the next day, they had drafted a counter lawsuit, housing discrimination, harassment, emotional distress. They subpoenaed HOA records, uncovering a pattern. No black family had ever lived in Willow Creek for more than a year before being forced out by excessive fines or intimidation. Then, Angela did something Richard Collins never expected. She went public. The reckoning asterisk. A local news station picked up the story. Soon, national outlets followed. Protesters gathered outside the HOA's next meeting, holding signs that read, HOAs shouldn't be hate groups. Richard Collins, sweating under the cameras, tried to defend himself. This is about rules, not race. But then Angela played the voicemail. You think you're so smart, Judge. Asterisk Richard's voice sneered in the recording. Asterisk, but you don't belong here. And I'll make sure you understand that. The room erupted. The fallout. Within a week, Richard Collins resigned asterisk in disgrace. The HOA board was dissolved and replaced. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into housing discrimination. And Angela? She stood on her porch one evening, watching Marcus ride his bike down the sidewalk, free, finally, from the weight of someone else's hatred. Willow Creek was still her home, and she wasn't going anywhere. Marcus. Angela's voice tore through the quiet afternoon air, raw with panic. The basketball still bounced lazily near the park bench, but her son was nowhere in sight. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she sprinted down the sidewalk, checking behind bushes, calling his name louder each time. Nothing. She fumbled for her phone, fingers shaking as she dialed 911. My son is missing, she gasped to the dispatcher. 9 years old, last seen near Willow Creek Park. Please, you have to help me. The police arrived within minutes, but just as they began questioning her, her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A text that turned her blood to ice. If you want your son back, follow HOA rules, or leave this neighborhood for good. And beneath it, those 3 letters, HOA. Angela's knees nearly buckled. She shoved the phone at the nearest officer. They took him, she whispered. They took him. Hashtag the security footage. The police moved fast. Within minutes, they pulled security footage from the park surveillance cameras. Angela stood behind the officers, her hands clenched into fists, watching the screen as the grainy images played out. There was Marcus, dribbling his basketball near the court. Then, Richard Collins appeared, flanked by 2 other HOA board members, Walter Greer and Linda Hartwell. They approached Marcus, their expressions stern. Marcus hesitated, then shook his head, backing away. That was when Walter stepped forward, gripping Marcus's arm. Angela let out a choke sound. Oh my God. The footage showed Marcus struggling as Richard leaned in, saying something the cameras couldn't pick up. Then, to her horror, they led him away, toward the HOA clubhouse. Hashtag the clubhouse. Police surrounded the building within minutes. Angela stood just behind them, her entire body trembling with fury and fear. Marcus, she screamed, her voice breaking. I'm here, baby. The door flew open. Linda Hartwell stepped out, her face pale. This is a misunderstanding. Before she could finish, Angela lunged forward. Where is my son? The officers pushed past Linda, storming inside. Seconds later, they emerged with Marcus, his face streaked with tears but unharmed. He sprinted into Angela's arms, sobbing into her shoulder. They said I had to go with them, Marcus cried. They said you were breaking the rules and had to leave. Angela clutched him tighter, her eyes burning with tears of rage. Over his shoulder, she saw Richard Collins being led out in handcuffs, his face twisted in defiance. You don't belong here, he spat at her. This was for the good of the community. Hashtag the arrests. By nightfall, Richard, Walter, and Linda were all in custody, charged with felony kidnapping, coercion, and conspiracy. The police uncovered more damning evidence, texts between them discussing how to scare the Johnson family out, and even a vote they'd taken at a secret HOA meeting about handling the situation. But the most chilling discovery? They had done this before. Records showed that years earlier, another black family had mysteriously left Willow Creek after their child was found wandering the neighborhood in distress. The police had never been called. No report was ever filed. Hashtag the reckoning. The news exploded. National headlines blared. HOA board kidnaps black child to force family out. Protesters swarmed Willow Creek, demanding justice. The remaining HOA members resigned in shame. And Angela? She stood on the steps of the courthouse the next day, holding Marcus's hand, facing a sea of cameras. This wasn't about HOA rules, she said, her voice steady despite the fire in her eyes. This was about racism, about power, and about men like Richard Collins thinking they could terrorize my family into leaving. She paused. But we're not going anywhere. Hashtag the aftermath. Richard Collins was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Walter and Linda received lesser terms, but would forever be branded as criminals. The HOA was disbanded, replaced by a new, inclusive neighborhood council, with Angela as its first chairperson. And Marcus? That night, as she tucked him into bed, he looked up at her with wide eyes. Are we safe now, Mom? Angela kissed his forehead. Yes, baby. Because sometimes you have to fight for your home. She turned off the light, leaving the door cracked open just enough to let the light in. Just enough to remind him, and herself, that the darkness wouldn't win. Not here. Not ever. The reckoning. Angela burst through the clubhouse doors with a team of officers at her back, her entire body vibrating with controlled fury. The sight before her made her blood boil. Marcus sat in a stiff wooden chair, his small frame trembling, while Richard Collins and his cronies stood over him, mid-argument. Should have just listened from the start, Richard was hissing to Walter, his voice dripping with venom. Now we have to make sure she... Then he saw Angela. For a split second, the room froze. Marcus's tear-streaked face lit up. Asterisk, Mom. Asterisk, he tried to bolt toward her, but Walter blocked his path, until an officer shoved the older man aside with a sharp, asterisk, step back. Now, asterisk. Angela didn't rush to Marcus just yet. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes locked on Richard. The air in the room turned to ice. Richard, she said, her voice lethally calm. Do you even know who you're dealing with? Richard recovered quickly, his lip curling into a sneer. Asterisk. All we know is you don't belong here. Asterisk. Angela didn't blink. She reached into her blazer, pulled out her federal credentials, and slapped them onto the table with a crack that made everyone flinch. I am Judge Angela Johnson, a federal judge. She let the words hang in the air, watching with cold satisfaction as Richard's face drained of color. And what you've just done, kidnapping, coercion, intimidation, isn't just a crime. It's a federal offense. Silence. Walter made a choke sound. Linda Hartwell took an unsteady step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Even the officers stiffened, exchanging glances. This had just escalated beyond a local dispute. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by something Angela recognized instantly. Fear. The fear of a man who'd spent years wielding petty power, only to realize he'd just picked a fight with someone far, far above his league. Angela turned to the lead officer, her tone leaving no room for debate. You know what to do. The cuffs came out. Richard sputtered as the officer wrenched his arms behind his back. Asterisk, you can't. This is a misunderstanding. We were just, asterisk. You kidnapped a child, Angela snarled, finally letting her rage surface. You terrorized my son to bully me out of my home. And you did it because you thought you could get away with it. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. But you picked the wrong woman to mess with. As Richard was marched out, his face ashen, Angela finally turned to Marcus. She dropped to her knees and pulled him into a crushing hug, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Asterisk, you're okay, baby. You're safe. Asterisk. Marcus clung to her, his small voice muffled against her shoulder. They said you were going to make us move. Angela pulled back, cupping his face. No one is ever taking our home from us. Not ever. Hashtag the fallout. By morning, the story was everywhere. Federal judge's son kidnapped in racist HOA plot dominated headlines. The FBI took over the case, and the charges stacked up: conspiracy, kidnapping, civil rights violations. Richard, Walter, and Linda faced decades in prison. The remaining HOA board members resigned in disgrace. The community, horrified by what had been done in their name, rallied around Angela, offering apologies, support, and promises of change. And Angela? She stood on her porch a week later, watching Marcus shoot hoops in the driveway, his laughter ringing through the neighborhood. The same neighbors who had once turned away now waved warmly. The same streets that had felt hostile now felt like home. Because Angela hadn't just won. She'd reclaimed what was hers. And Willow Creek would never be the same. A landmark case of justice asterisk. The trial of Richard Collins and his co-conspirators became a national spectacle, a stark expose of systemic racism hiding behind suburban respectability. News outlets ran damning headlines. HOA leaders kidnap black child in racist power play. Asterisk federal judge exposes hate in gated community. Asterisk legal analysts called it one of the most egregious abuses of homeowners association authority ever prosecuted in the U.S. Hashtag the trial that shook the nation. In court, the evidence was irrefutable. Security footage showed Richard, Walter, and Linda coercing Marcus into the clubhouse. Text messages revealed their conspiracy to scare the Johnsons out. Most damning of all, testimony from former residents, families of color who have been quietly pushed out of Willow Creek over the years through harassment, exorbitant fines, and veiled threats. The jury took less than 3 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts: kidnapping, conspiracy, and for the first time in the state's history, hate crimes tied to HOA discrimination. Richard Collins, once the smug king of a suburban fiefdom, stood trembling as the judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison. Walter and Linda received 15 and 12 years, respectively. As the bailiffs led them away, Richard turned to Angela, his voice breaking. Asterisk, you ruined my life. Asterisk. Angela didn't flinch. No, Richard, you did that yourself. Hashtag the end of the Willow Creek HOA. State investigators dismantled the HOA entirely after uncovering its decades-long pattern of discrimination. Fines were refunded to targeted families. The community's governing documents were rewritten under Angela's supervision, with strict anti-discrimination clauses and oversight to prevent future abuses. For the first time, Willow Creek's leadership reflected its actual residents. Diverse, inclusive, and accountable. Hashtag healing and solidarity. In the weeks after the trial, Angela's porch became a gathering place. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now brought casseroles, apologized, and asked how they could help. Mrs. Langley, the woman who had reported Marcus for playing too loudly, showed up one evening with tears in her eyes. I knew what they were doing was wrong, she admitted. Asterisk. I just didn't have the courage to speak up. Asterisk. Angela handed her a tissue. You do now. Marcus, though initially withdrawn, slowly regained his confidence. Therapy helped, but so did the neighborhood kids who now invited him to play without hesitation. One afternoon, Angela watched from the window as Marcus laughed on the same basketball court where he'd been taken, this time surrounded by friends. Hashtag a statement for the ages. At a press conference after the sentencing, Angela's words reverberated across the country. Asterisk, this was never just about me or my son. It's about every family who's ever been bullied, discriminated against, or made to feel like they don't belong. Justice is not optional, it's a right. And I will always stand for it. Asterisk, the clip went viral. Civil rights groups used it in campaigns. Law schools added it to their curricula. Even the White House cited her case when announcing new federal oversight for HOAs. Hashtag legacy of change. Angela's fight became a blueprint for challenging systemic racism in unexpected places. 3 states passed Marcus's law, prohibiting HOAs from weaponizing fines against protected classes. A documentary about the case, No Law Gnomes Allowed, won a Peabody Award. But for Angela, the real victory was simpler. Coming home each night to see Marcus sleeping peacefully in his own bed. No fear, no threats, just the quiet hum of a neighborhood that had finally chosen justice over complicity. As she turned off his bedroom light one evening, she whispered the same words she'd say every night since the trial. Asterisk, you're safe here. This is your home. Asterisk. And for the first time, she knew it was true.